Okay, so I really scored on this one. Heidi, the curator, was able. I mentioned I was in 9th Infantry Division. I was in MFO and Sinai, and the 9th Infantry Division portion of the museum is under reconstruction, and they're adding some new things. But she said, "Hey, I'll take you up there." So this is kind of a little an exclusive tour. But this is one thing I wanted to show everybody. Is so this is the Multinational Force and Observers. This is beret that I wore. I have one at home actually, just like this, from when I was in Egypt in 1988. This is the design of the BDUs at the time. We didn't really call them DCUs. This was prior to Desert Storm when I was there. And one thing I just wanted to note was during Desert Storm, the web gear was also tan. But while we were in Egypt, we did wear the chocolate chip pattern BDU that you see here, same that you would have seen in Desert Storm. But we did not have the color coordinated web gear, H harness and belt. That you would see in Desert Storm. We still had the green stuff, just exactly like you see here, including our name tags and our badges. What's interesting about this configuration that I noticed was I was in 347 Infantry, and this is an officer's uniform, and they actually have the, hope you guys can see that, that's the 4.7 right above the cross rifles. Those cross rifles were symbol of infantry, Army infantry, and then this was a lieutenant colonel. So you have a lieutenant colonel badge there, and actually down here, and I am not even kidding, but this guy looks familiar. Looks like a guy I knew by the last name of Critchlow, and I'm not kidding on that, people. I could be wrong, but that looks very familiar. The belt he's wearing, this guy, see, there was 13 nations there. Oh no, he has an American patch too, and they both have 9th Infantry Division patches, but his belt looks unique. I've never seen a belt buckle like that, but this was it. Oh, and then the other thing too, right behind this thing is this is the color boots we wore. We actually wore the green patterned jungle boots that were primarily noted for Vietnam, but that's the color of our jungle boots. They were the hot weather boots that that we wore. The one next to it looks like an engineering outfit. I don't know exactly what that is, but
that's for fighting fires. That's
from
the they fought in the Yellowstone fire in 1988.
1988. That's right.
Yeah,
I remember that.
It was a big fire.
Heidi just reminded me that there were some 9th Infantry guys that went to go fight in the Yellowstone fire in 1988, and because we were in Egypt we left in April, we came back in October. Was the Yellowstone fire within that time frame? Were we gone?
Yeah, I believe so, yes. You were probably gone during that.
So Fort Lewis 9th Infantry was very busy, either for the 6 months in the Sinai Peninsula. We were based out of South Camp, but I was on OP-32, if I can remember correctly. And then if you were back here at Fort Lewis, you actually went to go fight those fires, which thanks for reminding me. And then I'm going to show you one thing, and I'm going to pause the video. I just saw this over here. This is the 9th Infantry Division. We called it an octafoil because there's 8 little curly things to it. It's really, if you look up the 9th Infantry Division, it was disbanded, I believe in Desert Storm was in 90-91 time frame. So 9th Infantry was disbanded around 89-90. But most people associate that patch with what they did in Vietnam as a huge division that was in Vietnam. All right, this was a really cool, unique tour, so I got to give Heidi back her time and thank her, but really excited to see that. That's what I came down here for. Hey, I just wanted to mention, I just want to read this plaque to you guys. Desert Camouflage Uniform Task Force of the 3rd Battalion, 47th Infantry Regiment, 9th Infantry Division in the Sinai Desert, Egypt, April to October of '88. The uniform was worn by Lieutenant Colonel James Gribshaw while commanding Task Force of 3rd Battalion, 47th Infantry. So I would actually have to know what company he was in. I'd have to know what company he's in. The name actually does sound familiar, but I was brand new in the Army at the time. I was a E2, E3. And then Heidi pointed this out. This is the timeline of the 9th Infantry Division. So there's some historical stuff I think we'll maybe see downstairs starting in 1918. But she heard me trying to mention when it was disbanded. And what we have here, there might be a little bit of a glare. So it got disbanded in 91. And that was the last time that the octafoil patch had been worn. And there was a huge brack during that time. So we lost Fort Ord 7th AD in Central California and some other ones. And let me pop. So Heidi pointed out that, so here's a big rendition of the octafoil. We called it the cookie patch. She said she's also heard it referred to as the psychedelic cookie. I can imagine why, because of the colors. And then over here we have another painting of it with a couple of, looks like maybe an M1 Grand here, and then an M16 here, M16A1 here, and then a pineapple grenade and a percussion grenade. So, and then here's a last bit right here, 9th Infantry Division, Fort Lewis, Washington. Okay, so I'm back downstairs. That was just a really cool treat that Heidi was able to let me do. So this is the outside. This is a picture of the structure that we're in right now. I always wondered what it was, and she was telling me that it was originally a Salvation Army hotel, and it was kind of quasi on the property when they built it, and then when the military actually absorbed the property, acquired the property, apparently the Salvation Army sold it to the military for $1. What a real estate deal. Oh, and here's a model rendition of the building we're in. It is multiple floors, but right now, other than the little mid floor that Heidi took me to see the 9th Infantry Division display, everything that we're going to see inside is on the lower floor. And I did ask her about any restrictions of filming or photography on the inside or outside, and she said none. So I'm going to show you some vehicles outside later. Now the fort itself, there's some more people coming in. I'm going to try to stay a little quiet. The fort itself was named after Meriwether Lewis. When I was doing my bachelor's program, I was in a history class where I chose to do my term paper on the Lewis and Clark expedition. So Meriwether Lewis was what the fort was named after. And here's a little history of that. And what's going to be really interesting is that the Lewis and Clark expedition terminated more in the Portland, Oregon vicinity, started at St. Louis, which was the reason for the St. Louis Arch. So yeah, I better get that right before I get there. And I'll be seeing that in about a month on my Route 66 trip. So I get to see the beginning and ends of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Looks like a pretty big group of kids came in, so let's move around. Here's some keys, old hotel keys. I'm not sure at what point that these keys were being used for a hotel, but what this kind of would say to me is that when they relinquished it to the Army continued using it as a hotel for lodging. This is a really well put together Jeep Willys. I showed you some when I was down at Camp Roberts, but this one, woodland camouflage pattern. Let me back up a little bit so you guys can see a better view of it. Once again, I would really love to own one of these. This would be so cool to pull behind my RV. But there you go. I'm not sure if it's going to tell me the year of it. It actually says here, I think when I was telling you guys that when I was at Fort Lewis, we were driving these. So right here it says from 1980 to 1987, they used this Jeep here at Fort Lewis. So I joined the Army in 87, but when I came back from Egypt in 88, we had switched over to the Humvees. This is another rendition of the octafoil. So you have the octafoil here, blue is always up, there's the 8 points, and then behind it is a painting rendition of the original Fort Lewis gates. I'm not sure what era that would be, but those gates were off to the side of the main gate when I was up here the first time. Here's a funny story for you. See this weapon up here? That's called that's a 45 caliber, nicknamed a grease gun. When I was in 113 armored personnel carriers, we would have to get grease guns to pump into the wheels for the track tension. And so when we ordered 3 grease guns intending for track vehicle tension, actual grease that comes out of a pumped gun, we opened up our TO&E boxes, and the supply guy, I don't know where he found them, but there were 3 of those, three of these little submachine gun looking. I've never even trained with one of those or seen one, but no, we put it on the order form for our track vehicle maintenance on the 113s, and they actually put 3 of those in the box, and we didn't have grease guns to do our maintenance on our wheels, so we borrowed some from a tank company, rolled by, and we were able to get a purpose-hole grease gun from them. When I first got to Fort Lewis, it was actually after jump school, so it was, I believe, January, February of 1988. This is a sand rail, and they had these, I guess they trained and they tested these out right before I got there in 1988, and we actually had these chained up in front of our battalion area to a tree. They looked just like this, and it was chained up to a tree. There's like 1 or 2 of them. I've never seen them in operation. I've never used it, but they used to be on display right outside our battalion area. And then here it shows a picture of one in action. Where this is at, I don't know. I think that's a tow that's mounted on the back. See, it was an experimental prototype used by the 9th Infantry Division, motorized from 1981 to 1986. So it was a sand air dune buggy. So if this was actually used 1986, that means they stopped using, well, obviously a year or 2 before I got in there, but they kept them on display right outside the battalion area. So now we're looking at the Scout bike. So if this looks familiar to anybody, this is a Kawasaki, the same company, the motorcycle I'm riding right now. So it was the Scout bike. Here you have, this is the BDU pattern I would wear. There's the octafoil on his shoulder, 9th Infantry Division. I don't know what model this is. It says here, I'll keep it pointed at the motorcycle, I'll just read it. The Kawasaki motorcycle was tested at Fort Lewis and the Yakima Training Center for use by Scouts in the 9th Infantry Division, motorized, intended to give the Scouts speed and maneuverability on the battlefield. The end of the Cold War also ended the Army's plans for a motorized division. So I was motorized, yeah. I was 9th Infantry motorized, not mechanized, motorized. But that looks a lot like the predecessor to what my KLR is today. I mean, if you look at the shocks, this is really cool. I'll have to come back and get some still shots of this. I mean, I even think that that's the exact turn indicators I have on mine. The chain and swing arm looks a little different. Kickstand looks the same. Shift lever, there's a lot of it that looks the same. Obviously, this is air cooled. Mine's water cooled. So as you can see, there's no radiator in front. But very cool. There you are. There's the Scout Kawasaki right there. Now, when I went to basic, this is I guess for training basic, my bunk wasn't that thin. I don't think it was, but I remember doing my bedding like that. There's an older rifle. I'm going to swing around here in a little bit. I'm going back to where that grease gun was. I was going to show you this 30 caliber. I never fired one of those. I think they were just coming out of the inventory. We were using the M60 machine gun when I was here. So here's a couple of weapons we have. We have the M1 Grand up top, M1 carbine. I actually have one of those. M1 carbine I have, and 45 ACP, government 45. Now here's an older uniform. What I wanted to point this out was I was in the 40th Infantry Division, which was that octafoil, 40th ID. The 41st, this is a first sergeant rank, but the 41st, I believe, was the infantry division that my father-in-law was in, and I believe he wore that patch. And I also believe it was for the Washington State's Army National Guard at the time. I'm going to point these out real quick. This is some older uniforms. This one here is World War I era officer uniform. The cross cannon, so he's artillery. He has cross cannons on his collar, so he's artillery. This one has cross rifles, so this has been an infantry uniform. And this is 1920s to 30s. This is after this one. Probably can kind of tell from their hats too. Although more on the smaller scale than I expected, they do a really good job on these demoramas for this for this museum. Here's an artillery piece, but one thing I wanted to point out, which I have an appreciation that they got correct, was even through the Civil War era, even now, if you notice, he's wearing a red cord around his hat. Red was indicative of artillery, light blue was indicative of infantry, and maroon was medical. I don't know what every color means for every discipline or job function, but it was cool to see that there's an artillery piece, and they have the red braid around his hat signifying he was an artillery troop. Now this part isn't necessarily with Fort Lewis, but it's Army involvement in the Puget Sound, and this is showing the coastal forts of the Puget Sound. And if we get in close, hopefully maybe you could see it, but Fort Hayden, Camp Hayden, Fort Whitman, Fort Eby, Fort Casey, Fort Warden, Fort Flagler, Fort Lawton, Fort Ward. I think I've been to Fort Lawton, might have been to Fort Ward also. But these were coastal artillery installations that defended the coast and defended the ports, much like they had in Hawaii. And they had these huge guns. Some of these museums, they still keep the gun emplacements and the guns in there. And this is just a rendition of someone sighting in a possible target. Now, one thing I was going to show, waiting for some people to clear out. When I was down at Camp Roberts, I was talking about the difference between the term camp and forts. So here you have a sign behind me that says Camp Lewis. So I'm not sure when they evolved from calling them camps, and then over here too it says Camp Lewis. But I'm not sure at what point they go from camp to forts, and then Marine Corps remain calling theirs camps. This is kind of a funny diorama. So here is kind of like how I started out with. I wasn't wearing exactly that clothes, but a guy like that was yelling at me a lot 31 years ago when I went to basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky. But they do a really good job on these dioramas with uniforms, kind of portraying military life through the years. And I believe the way they had this organized, I walked backwards. The way that it organized was earlier days to current time. As the United States started expanding westward, prior to the Civil War, we went into the Indian Wars and the Indian campaigns. And even after the Civil War, there were still some skirmishes with Native Americans. I'm not, saying what's politically right or wrong. I'm just trying to get as close to history as possible. What's interesting on this one is that you have an Indian or Native American here with a U.S. troop and an artillery piece. Now, oftentimes I refer to myself as at one point in my career being a scout. Well, the scout capabilities and tactics really came from the Indians. So the first scouts that the military used, the U.S. military used, were actually Native American Indians, and we learned a lot of our training and tactics from them. And then there's just some older rifles in the back. This section of the museum is talking about the Pig War timeline. Spanish and British explorers coming to this side of the world. I'm not going to expound on that right now, but I'm just going to bring out the importance of these types of museums, especially if you're a college student or you want to learn more about military history, U.S. history, or the history of the area that you live in. And it falls the same with either these museums or going to your local public library to do some research. This just has an older artillery piece that was used. That would have been, I can't say it's been used, but it was the time era of the Pig War. This is actually where most people will start their tour, is at the Lewis and Clark expedition, talking about the core discovery. I thought I knew a lot about the Lewis and Clark expedition when I started my paper, when I was doing the paper in college, and it's really, really amazing. I mean, reading periodicals, reading from historians that actually documented a lot of these events, journals that were taken from some of these guys, the idea of exactly what Sacagawea's role is, how they hooked up with her, and what the importance was of her role in the expedition as a Native American. We're moving into another rendition, Fort Steilacoom, life in the barracks circa 1850, and I'll turn around here. These bunks are like about 4 feet long, so I don't think, this is just to get an idea, but I don't think that anyone actually slept on these. No one slept on these bunks except for this fake cat, which I thought was real. There's something kind of interesting. These were just going out of inventory. This is what the MRE replaced, but I've actually ate a few of these, and although they're all green, it's pretty much same type of canned food that you'd find in the store today, except they were going to something lighter, more portable, and we went over to the MREs, which I can actually do a whole video on how the MREs are packed and prepared and carried, and how we would have eaten them. But only maybe 1 or 2 times maybe 3 times I've actually eaten the sea rations that were made out of the cans. So I'm gonna wrap this one up. I'm in the gift shop right now. It's kind of quiet. I just wanted to just sign off and say I'm gonna be doing some filming on the outside with armored vehicles. So this is gonna be, once again, it's gonna be 1 of 2. Thank you.